Hey everybody, what's up? And welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and today we finish this book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the show, hit the like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you get notified about future videos. Also, stay tuned for the next book, State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration by James Risen of the Intercept, I believe. Let's dig in, shall we? Ramped up militarization. The Chagos Archipelago comprises more than 60 small coral islands isolated in the Indian Ocean halfway between Africa and Indonesia, 1,000 miles south of the nearest continent, India. Between 1968 and 1973, the United States and Britain, the latter the colonial administrator, forcibly removed the indigenous inhabitants of the islands, the Chagosians. Most of the 2,000 deportees ended up more than 1,000 miles away in Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they were thrown into lives of poverty and forgotten. The purpose of this expulsion was to create a major U.S. military base on one of the Chagosian islands, Diego Garcia, as if being rounded up and removed from their homelands in the name of global security were not cruel enough. Before being deported, the Chagosians had to watch as British agents and U.S. troops herded their pet dogs into sealed sheds. God, that's awful. Where they were gassed and burned. As David Vine writes in his chronicle of this tragedy, the base on Diego Garcia has become one of the most secretive and powerful U.S. military facilities in the world, helping to launch the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq twice, and threatening Iran, China, Russia, and nations from southern Africa to Southeast Asia. That was Southeast Asia. I had a hard time coming out of my mouth. Host to a secret CIA detention center for high-profile terror suspects, and home to thousands of U.S. military personnel and billions of dollars in deadly weaponry. I don't know what to say. Ever heard of that place? The Chagosians? Diego Garcia base? Me either. The Chagosians are not the only indigenous people around the world that the U.S. military has displaced. The military established a pattern during and after the Vietnam War of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from sites deemed strategic for the placement of military bases. The peoples of the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific and Puerto Rico's Vieques Island are perhaps the best known examples, but there were also the Inuit? I want to say Inuit, but it's spelled in a way I've never seen. Inuguit of Thule, Greenland, and the thousands of Okinawans and indigenous peoples of Micronesia. During the harsh deportation of the Micronesians in the 1970s, the press took some notice. In response to one reporter's question, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said of the Micronesians, "There are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn?" This is a statement of permissive genocide. By the beginning of the 21st century, the United States operated more than 900 military bases around the world, including 287 in Germany. Wow. 130 in Japan, 106 in South Korea, 89 in Italy, 57 in the British Isles, 21 in Portugal, and 19 in Turkey. The number also comprised additional bases or installations located in Aruba, Australia, Djibouti, Egypt, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Crete, Sicily, Iceland, Romania, Bulgaria, Honduras, Colombia, and Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, among many other locations in some 150 countries, along with those recently added in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm getting stressed reading this. Are you? In her book, The Militarization of Indian Country, Anishinaabe activist and writer Winona LaDuke analyzes the continuing negative effects of the military on Native Americans, considering the consequences wrought on Native economy, land, future, and people, especially Native combat veterans and their families. Indigenous territories in New Mexico bristle with nuclear weapons storage, and Shoshone and Paiute territories in Nevada are scarred by decades of above-ground and underground nuclear weapons testing. The Navajo Nation and some New Mexico pueblos have experienced decades of uranium strip mining, the pollution of water, and subsequent deadly health effects. I am awed by the impact of the military on the world and on Native America, LaDuke writes. It is pervasive. Political scientist Cynthia Enlow, who specializes in U.S. foreign policy and the military, observes that U.S. culture has become even more militarized since the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. You think? Her analysis of this trend draws on a feminist perspective. Militarization is happening at the individual level when a woman who has a son is persuaded that the best way she can be a good mother is to allow the military recruiter to recruit her son so her son will get off the couch. When she is persuaded to let him go, even if reluctantly, she's being militarized. She's not as militarized as somebody who is a special forces soldier, but she's being militarized all the same. Somebody who gets excited because a jet bomber flies over the football stadium to open the football season and is glad that he or she is in the stadium to see it is being militarized. So militarization is not just about the question, do you think the military is the most important part of the state? Although obviously that matters. It's not just, do you think that the use of collective violence is the most effective way to solve social problems, which is also a part of militarization, but it is also about ordinary daily culture, certainly in the United States. I think that's a really great quotation. As John Grenier notes, however, the cultural aspects of militarization are not new. They have deep historical roots reaching into the nation's British colonial past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries. Beyond its, this is John Grenier, this is a quotation. Beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also found a use for the first way of war in the construction of an American identity, the enduring appeal of the romanticized myth of the settlement, not the conquest of the frontier, either by either by actual men, such as Robert Rogers or Daniel Boone, or fictitious ones like Nathaniel Bumppo of James Fenimore Cooper's creation, points to what D.H. Lawrence called the myth of the essential white American. The astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians with the Second Amendment as a sacred mandate is also intricately related to militaristic culture. Everyday life and the culture in general are damaged by ramped up militarization, and this includes academia, particularly the social sciences, with psychologists and anthropologists being recruited as advisors to the military. Anthropologist David H. Price, in his indispensable book Weaponizing Anthropology, there's a phrase you never heard before, remarks that anthropology has always fed between the lines of war. Anthropology was born of European and U.S. colonial wars. Price, like Enlow, sees an accelerated pace of militarization in the early 21st century. Today's weaponization of anthropology and other social sciences has been a long time coming, and post 9/11, America's climate of fear, coupled with reductions in traditional academic funding, provided the conditions of a sort of perfect storm for the militarization of the discipline and the academy as a whole. In their 10-part cable television documentary series and 1,700-page companion book, The Untold History of the United States, which, by the way, has been recently updated. Can't wait to check it out. You should too. Filmmaker Oliver Stone and historian Peter Kuznick ask, why does our country have military bases in every region of the globe, totaling more than 1,000 by some counts? Why does the United States spend as much money on its military as the rest of the world combined? Why does it still possess thousands of nuclear weapons, many on hair-trigger alert, even though no nation poses an imminent threat? These are key questions. Stone and Kuznick condemn the situation but do not answer the questions. The authors see the post-World War II development of the United States into the world's sole superpower as a sharp divergence from the founders' original intent and historical development prior to the mid-20th century. They quote an Independence Day speech by President John Quincy Adams in which he condemned British colonialism and claims that the United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Stone and Kuznick failed to mention that the United States, at the time, was invading, subjecting, colonizing, and removing the indigenous farmers from their land, as it had since its founding, and it would through the 19th century. In ignoring that fundamental basis for U.S. development as an imperialist power, they do not see that the overseas empire was the logical outcome of the course the United States chose at its founding. North America is a crime scene. Jody Bird writes, the story of the New World is horror. The story of America is a crime. It is necessary, she argues, to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain the historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what has happened to and with indigenous peoples and what still happens. It's not just past colonialist actions, but also the continued colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands that allows the United States to cast its imperialist gaze globally with what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect multicultural, multiracial democracy, while the status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt and inflect its raison d'etre. That was the quotation at the beginning of the chapter, I'm sure of it. Here Bird quotes Lakota scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who spells out the connection between the Indian Wars and the Iraq War. The current mission of the United States to become the center of political enlightenment to be taught to the rest of the world began with the Indian Wars and has become the dangerous provocation of this nation's historical intent. The historical connection between the Little Bighorn event and the uprising in Baghdad must become part of the political dialogue of America if the fiction of decolonization is to happen and the hoped for deconstruction of the colonial story is to come about. A race of innocence is what occurs when individuals assume that they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression. This concept captures the understandable assumption made by new immigrants or children of recent immigrants to any country. They cannot be responsible, they assume, for what occurred in their adopted country's past. Neither are those who are already citizens guilty, even if they are descendants of slave owners, Indian killers, or Andrew Jackson himself. Yet in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma has entailed in settling the land affects the assumptions and behaviors of living generations at any given time, including immigrants and the children of recent immigrants. In the United States, the legacy of settler colonialism can be seen in the endless wars of aggression and occupations, the trillions spent on war machinery, military bases, and personnel instead of social services and quality public education, the gross profits of corporations, each of which has greater resources and funds than more than half the countries in the world, yet pay minimal taxes and provide few jobs for U.S. citizens. The repression of generation after generation of activists who seek to change the system, the incarceration of the poor, particularly descendants of enslaved Africans, the individualism carefully inculcated that on the one hand produces self-blame for personal failure, and on the other exalts ruthless dog-eat-dog competition for possible success, even though it rarely results, and high rate of suicides, drug abuse, alcoholism, sexual violence against women and children, homelessness, dropping out of school, and gun violence. I'm going to give you a minute to let all that sink in. Ready? These are symptoms, and there are many more, of a deeply troubled society, and they are not new. The large and influential civil rights, student labor, and women's movements of the 1950s through the 1970s exposed the structural inequalities in the economy and the historical effects of more than 2 centuries of slavery and brutal genocidal wars waged against indigenous peoples. For a time, U.S. society verged on a process of truth-seeking regarding past atrocities, making demands to end aggressive wars and to end poverty, witnessed by the huge peace movement of the 1970s and the war on poverty, affirmative action, school busing, prison reform, women's equity and reproductive rights, promotion of the arts and humanities, public media, the Indian Self-Determination Act, and many other initiatives. A more sophisticated version of the race to innocence that helps perpetuate settler colonialism began to develop in social movement theory in the 1990s, popularized in the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. Commonwealth, the third volume in a trilogy, is one of a number of books in an academic fad of the early 21st century seeking to revive the medieval European concept of the commons as an aspiration for contemporary social movements. Most writings about the commons barely mention the fate of indigenous peoples in relation to the call for all land to be shared. Two Canadian scholar activists, Nandita Sharma and Cynthia Wright, for example, do not mince words in rejecting native land claims and sovereignty, characterizing them as xenophobic elitism. Wow. They see indigenous claims as regressive neo-racism in light of the global diasporas arising from oppression around the world. Cree scholar Lorraine LeCamp calls this kind of erasure of indigenous peoples in North America terra nullism, harking back to the characterization under the doctrine of discovery of purportedly vacant lands as terra nullis. Okay? This is a kind of no-fault history from the theory of a liberated future of no borders and nations, of a vague commons for all. The theorists obliterate the present and presence of indigenous nations struggling for their liberation from states of colonialism. Thereby, indigenous rhetoric and programs for decolonization, nationhood, and sovereignty are, according to this project, rendered invalid and futile. From the indigenous perspective, as Jody Bird writes, any notion of the commons that speaks for and as indigenous as it advocates transforming indigenous governance or incorporating indigenous peoples into a multitude that might then reside on those lands forcibly taken from indigenous peoples does nothing to disrupt the genocidal and colonialist intent of the initial and now repeated historical process. Body parts. Another aspect of the demand for U.S. public dominion appears under the guise of science. Despite the passage in 1990 of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, some researchers under the cloak of science have fought tooth and nail not to release the remains and burial offerings of some 2 million indigenous people held in storage, much of it uncatalogued, in the Smithsonian Institution and other museums and by universities, state historical societies, National Park Service offices, warehouses, and curio shops. Nothing more disrespectful than your ancestor's bone in a curio shop. Until the 1990s, archaeologists and physical anthropologists claimed to need the remains, which they labeled resources or data, but rarely as human remains, for scientific experimentation, but most were randomly stored in boxes. In doing so, they also challenged the definition of Native American and the claimant's right to sovereignty. They even accused Native Americans of being anti-science for seeking to repatriate the remains of their relatives. However, since anthropologist Franz Boas in 1911 discredited the theories of racial superiority and inferiority upon which such research was premised, little actual examination of the indigenous body parts has taken place. When Ishi, identified by Anglos in 1911 as the last of the Yahi people of Northern California, died in 1916, the University of California at Berkeley anthropologist who had studied him and his culture, Arthur Kroeber, insisted on an indigenous traditional burial and no autopsy, according to Ishi's wishes. When asked about the cause of science, Kroeber said, "If there is any talk about the interest of science, say for me that science can go to hell. Besides, I cannot believe that any scientific value is materially involved. We have hundreds of Indian skeletons that nobody ever comes to study." Despite Kroeber's stance, Ishi's brain was removed and preserved and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. An anthropologist, Eric Davis, observes the bodies have never had scientific value. Rather, they have become a fetish, a marker of value, the power of which derives specifically from the obscuring of the referent, with an F, referent, to which it originally referred. It is my claim that an Indian identity and its material form, the native dead body, has functioned for a very long time and with increasing power as a fetish marking the possession of land by those who have conquered it already. The Kennewick Man phenomenon of the 1990s revealed much about the pathology Davis references. In 1996, a nearly complete skeleton and skull were found on a riverbank on traditional land of the Umatilla Nation near Kennewick, Washington. The county coroner determined that the bones were ancient, at least 9,000 years old, holy cow, and therefore Native American. Under NAGRA, they should be handed over to the Umatilla authorities. But a local archaeologist, James C. Chatters, asked to examine the remains. Several weeks later, Chatters called a press conference at which he proclaimed the remains to be Caucasoid, and with a story to tell. Up to that moment, little attention had been paid to the find, but with Chatters' claims it became a public sensation, fueled by headlines such as "Europeans Invade America, 20,000 BC. Discover magazine. Was someone here before the Native Americans? The New Yorker. America before the Indians. U.S. News and World Report. And Hunt for the First Americans. National Geographic. The archaeologist had made a series of logical conclusions from a bogus premise. The remains were ancient. The skeleton and skull were said not to resemble those of living natives and might be more akin to those of modern Europeans. Therefore, Europeans were the first Americans. The Archaeological Institute of America dismissed such claims, denouncing the already discredited science of determining racial characteristics projected back in time. Yet the claims stuck in the public mind and a media bias. Clearly the controversy was not about science, but rather about native claims of antiquity, sovereignty, and rights, and settler resentment. Chatters made this clear when he was interviewed on the CBS program 60 Minutes. The tribe's fight against further testing of Kennewick Man is based largely on fear fear that if someone was here before they were, their status as sovereign nations and all that go with it, treaty rights and lucrative casinos, could be at risk. The white supremacist group Asutru Folk Assembly made a similar assessment. Kennewick Man is our kin. Native American groups have strongly contested this idea, perceiving that they have much to lose if their status as the first Americans is overturned. We will not let our heritage be hidden by those who seek to obscure it. Chatters claimed that Kennewick Man has so many stories to tell. When you work with these individuals, you develop an empathy. It's like you know another individual intimately. I hope he doesn't know that intimately. I know. Sorry. That was gross. Eric Davis, calling this identification with the remains, a scientist studies pathological ventriloquism, points out that even the judge who sided with Chatters in the dispute with the Umatilla Nation got into the act saying that the remains were a book that they can read, a history written in bone instead of on paper, just as the history of a region may be read by observing layers of rock or ice, or the rings of a tree. 45 years ago, archaeologist Robert Silverberg wrote about the appeal of lost tribes to Anglo-Americans. The dream of a lost prehistoric race in the American heartland was profoundly satisfying. And if the vanished ones had been giants, or white men, or Israelites, or Danes, or Toltecs, or great white Jewish Toltec Vikings, so much the better. Anything but Indians, for that would provide evidence reminding Anglo settlers' descendants that the continent was stolen, genocide committed, and the land repopulated by settlers who seek authenticity but never find it because of the lie they live with, suspecting the truth and fearing it. Ghosts and demons to hide from. A living symbol of the genocidal history of the United States, as well as a kind of general subconscious knowledge of it, is the Winchester Mystery House. That's not very far from where I live, about 2 hours. A tourist site in the Santa Clara Valley of Northern California, also known as Silicon Valley. 50 miles south of San Francisco, it is billed as a ghost house on billboards that start appearing in Oregon to the north and San Diego to the south. That's true. I see billboards over, like 20 minutes from me. That's not really that close to that house, but alright, whatever. Sorry, I got off on a tangent. Sarah L. Winchester, the wealthy widow of William Wirt Winchester, built the Victorian mansion to avoid and elude ghosts, although there is no record of any ghosts ever having found their way into her home. It could be said, perhaps, that Mrs. Winchester's project from 1884 to her death in 1922 was a success. She likely was well aware of the widely publicized ghost dance in 1890, which led to the killing of Sitting Bull and the Wounded Knee massacre. The dancers believed that the dance would bring back their dead warriors. It makes sense that Mrs. Winchester felt the need to guard herself from the ghosts of those killed by the Winchester repeating rifles, which her late husband's father had invented and produced in 1866, with later models being even more lethal. Mrs. Winchester inherited the fortune accumulated by her husband's family through sales of the rifle. There was one major purchaser the U.S. Department of War. The chief reason of the War Department's purchases of the rifle in great quantities: to kill Indians. The rifle was a technological innovation designed especially for the U.S. Army's campaigns against the Plains Indians following the Civil War. The Winchester House amazes all who tour it. There are 5 floors more or less, since they are staggered. Each room in itself appears normal, decorated in the late 19th century Victorian mode, but there is more than meets the eye in getting from parlors to bedrooms to kitchen to closets and from floor to floor. Numerous stairways dead end and secret trapdoors hide the actual stairways. Closet doors open to walls, and pieces of furniture are really doors to closets. Huge bookcases serve as entrances to adjoining rooms. Part of the house was unfinished when the widow died, as she had construction workers building every day from dawn to dusk, adding rooms and traps until her death. Visitors trekking through the widow's home are astounded and perhaps saddened by the evidence all around them of the fears and anguish of an obviously mentally disturbed person. Yet there is another possibility, a sense of the scaffolding that supports U.S. society, a kind of hologram in the minds of each and every person on the continent. Mrs. Winchester might have been more aware of the truth than most people, and therefore fearful of its consequences. Regardless, in continuing to find or invent enemies across the globe, expand what is already the largest military force in the world, and add to an elaborate global network of military bases, all in the name of national or global security. Does not the United States today resemble Mrs. Winchester, constantly trying to foil her ghosts? The guilt harbored by most is buried and expressed in other ways on a larger scale, as in the title of Richard Slotkin's Regeneration Through Violence. I find that comparison rather apt. The future. How then can U.S. society come to terms with its past? How can it acknowledge responsibility? The late Native historian Jack Forbes always stressed that while living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did, they are responsible for the society they live in, which is a product of that past. Assuming this responsibility provides a means of survival and liberation, everyone and everything in the world is affected for the most part negatively by U.S. dominance and intervention, often violently through direct military means or through proxies. And she's not even talking about the political pressures, the sanctions that target civilians. It is an urgent concern. Historian and teacher Juan Gomez Quinones writes, American Indian ancestries and heritage ought to be integral to K-12 curriculums and university explorations and graduate expositions, with full integration of Native American histories and cultures into academic curriculums. Gomez Quinones coins a measure of intelligence in the United States, the Indigenous quotient. The Indigenous quotient. So how would you rate on the Indigenous quotient? Better if you've been watching this show. Indigenous peoples offer... Oh, come on, give me a like and a subscribe for that one. Indigenous peoples offer possibilities for life after empire, possibilities that neither erase the crimes of colonialism nor require the disappearance of the original peoples colonized under the guise of including them as individuals. That process rightfully starts by honoring the treaties the United States made with indigenous nations, by restoring all sacred sites, starting with the Black Hills and including most federally held parks and land and all stolen sacred items and body parts, and by payment of sufficient reparations for the reconstruction and expansion of native nations. In the process, the continent will be radically reconfigured, physically and psychologically. For the future to be realized, it will require extensive educational programs and the full support and active participation of the descendants of settlers, enslaved Africans, and colonized Mexicans, as well as immigrant populations. In the words of Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, the future will not be made with loss and waste through the memory will, though. Let me start that over. The future will not be made with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed it, hit the like and subscribe button. Stay tuned for the next book, The State of War, The Secret History of the CIA and the Bush administration. I hope this book was able to bring some understanding into how indigenous people can see the world differently, see through different lens than white people. There is no uniform Native American experience. You know, all peoples are diverse peoples. But I hope that, you know, just bring some understanding of at least to the history and the skepticism we should probably all have. The more you learn about your government, the more you should be skeptical. You'll learn a lot about it if you watch this show, this channel. So keep on watching. We'll learn about the Bush administration and the CIA next, and the war on terror. So thanks for joining me. See you next time.